This is the Holy Gospel according to Luke. Now on that same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and talking with each other about all these things that had happened. While they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself came near and went with them, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he said to them, "What are you discussing with each other while you walk along?" They stood still, looking sad. Then one of them, whose name was Clopas, answered him, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have taken place in these days?" He asked them, "What things?" They replied, "The things about Jesus of Nazareth, who is a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and leaders handed him over to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all this, it's now the 3rd day since these things took place. Moreover, some women of our group astounded us. They were at the tomb early this morning, and when they did not find his body there, they came back and told us that they had indeed seen a vision of angels who said he was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see him." And he said to them, "Oh, how foolish you are, and how slow of heart to believe all the prophets have declared. Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and then enter into his glory?" Then, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them the things about himself in all the scriptures. As they came near the village to which they were going, he walked ahead as if he were going on, but they urged him strongly, saying, "Stay with us, because it's almost evening and the day is now nearly over." So he went in to stay with them. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to them. And their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. They said to each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he was talking to us on the road, while he was opening the scriptures to us?" That same hour they got up and returned to Jerusalem, and they found the 11 and their companions gathered together. They were saying, "The Lord has risen indeed, and he has appeared to Simon." Then they told what had happened on the road and how he had been made known to them in the breaking of the bread. This is the gospel of the Lord.
This is the road to Emmaus from the gospel story. Okay, that's a lie. This is actually Leicester Road in Pleasant Ridge near my house. That's my kid's school up there at the top, but it could be the road to Emmaus. Jesus was constantly meeting people while he was out and about, going from here to there. Sometimes we see folks meet him in a building for sure, but at least as often, if not more, he's on the road and someone comes up to him to ask him a question or beg for healing, or he just comes across someone who needs him along the way. He doesn't expect people to come find him, though they very much do seek him out. No, Jesus goes out into the world and finds them. Now, we're all physically distancing these days. It's the hot new thing. And the good news is it's working, just, slowly. And we're not there yet. But that means we can't go out and about like we used to, not like Jesus did, laying hands on people or spitting in their eyes to heal them. Gross, right? But we still can go out a little and carefully. My neighbor and I have set up driveway dates where we sit in lawn chairs on opposite sides of the driveway and catch up. Our family walks in our neighborhood. We wave at people from a distance. We knock on people's doors and chat with them from the sidewalk. My point is, that road that Jesus was always meeting people on while he was out and about, it wasn't just that exact one leading to the town of Emmaus. It was all the roads. And it wasn't just those 2 disciples he meets and talks with. It's all of us. Jesus the Christ is as present to us as he was to those disciples, which is to say, extremely unequivocally present, but also really, really difficult to see. You may have noticed in the gospel a couple weeks ago that Mary Magdalene, in her grief after Jesus' death and her bafflement when the angel tells her that Jesus isn't there in the tomb where, by all rights, his body ought to be, she runs into Jesus there in the garden and mistakes him for the gardener. And this week 2 of Jesus' closest friends are grieving and just as baffled by the stories about his resurrection. And they too mistake him for just some dude on the road. There's another story where the disciples are out fishing in a boat and they see a guy grilling up fish on the shore and they don't recognize it's Jesus, but then suddenly they do, and Peter jumps into the lake to swim back immediately. He can't even wait to put his clothes back on or for the boat to make its way back. Very on brand for Peter, really. Post-resurrection Jesus doesn't look like pre-resurrection Jesus somehow. And it's not because he's stolen the gardener's clothing or he's playing dress up like Martha Stewart to make them brunch or that he's like a master of disguise. It's because he's fundamentally changed. He is Jesus of Nazareth, and he is no longer only Jesus of Nazareth. There's a long-standing question about what precisely happened in the resurrection. Literally since the first moment, and for the last 2,000 years, we've been wondering what it's all about. On the surface, it's that he was dead and now he's alive again, which is huge and enough to be wrestling with for the rest of our lives, but there are other questions. What was it like for God to die on the cross? Not like the specific pain, but the experience that God had of being alive and then not alive. And how precisely does God die? How does this event defeat death? Like, is it about punishment or about debt payment or showing us our violent selves? How important is physical resurrection to this scenario? And what does it all mean? Of course, there are no final solid answers beyond love and new life. But one understanding that is deeply embedded in our scriptures and that has caught the imagination of Christians for centuries is this. In the resurrection event, Jesus of Nazareth, however you conceive of him, transforms more fully into Christ, and in doing so becomes fully present and visible in every single person and every single part of creation. And what the heck does that mean, Pastor Alice? Well, it's hard to articulate. Words aren't near enough, but resurrection is a revealing that everything visible, without exception, is the outpouring of God. Not just God washing things clean or giving a little bit of God's self to the world, but God pouring out God's own self, God's own being into the containers of all that is. Hear that again and let it roll around in your heart. Everything visible, without exception, is the outpouring of God. Look out your window or at the photos on your wall or into your memory. Everything visible, without exception, is the outpouring of God. I borrowed that line from Brother Richard Rohr in his book, The Universal Christ, highly recommended. And I'm sure it sounds a little weird, but I assure you it's deeply biblical. The Christ, the Messiah, the Anointed One, it's not just Jesus' last name, and it's not even his job. It's the second person of the Trinity, present at the creation of the universe when God poured God's self into every living being. That moment of creation was kind of a first incarnation, God taking on physical form as light and life and breath, inhabiting everything. We Christians say Christ has been present in everything visible without exception ever since then, and is, because of Jesus of Nazareth's life, death, and resurrection, now more visible to us. Because of the resurrection, it's possible for us to see Christ in every person we meet. Not only in Jesus, that amazing, confounding, transformative God-man, but Christ, who is infinite love, infinitely giving itself away, visible and available to us in every single person and living thing around us. Everybody got it? I know, it's a lot. But this mysteriousness, it's a feature of our faith, not a bug. Let me give you an example. Several years ago, I met Jesus in a gas station parking lot, bought him a cup of coffee. Some of you have read my book, How to Human. You will recognize this story. I think it fits here. I'd popped down the street from the Edge House to our local UDF to pick up a couple gallons of whole milk for lattes. I was grabbing the door handle to go in when I heard shoes scraping on the pavement, and I turned around to look. He was a very put-together, middle-aged man, dressed in a suit and tie with trench coat over his arm, his skin dark and smooth, pulling a wheeled suitcase with a broken handle. He was muttering angrily about schedules and timing. He looked like he was about to cry. I asked if he was okay. He looked at me and his face opened up like a gift. He said, "I'm Jesus Christ and my father's abandoned me and I don't know why." He went on, always on the verge of sobbing, about how he came down off the cross and someone else died there in his place, and Peter and John and all wouldn't talk to him. He talked about how his father, God, was cruel to him and about how much he loved his father. I noticed he wasn't as put together as I'd thought. His suit was badly frayed at the cuffs and around the collar, his white shirt more ivory from wear, and also he was obviously not Jesus Christ. But at my previous church, we referred to folks who came to the door asking for help with rent or gas or food as Jesuses. Where's Father Jim? He's talking to Jesus. It wasn't snide or mocking, but a reminder that Jesus told us over and over that he's with these folks, that he is these folks. The people who need help, the people we would just as soon pass by and continue on our merry way, they are Jesus in a mystical way. They reflect back to us our own Jesusness. So I bought my new friend Jesus Christ a cup of gas station coffee. I listened to his story and he walked away. He didn't once ask for anything, just wanted to talk about his pain. I felt off balance. I hadn't been expecting to meet Jesus. I hadn't been expecting to give some of my time to this suffering man on the way to picking up milk. I hadn't been expecting to feel lighter and more connected because of it. But I did. He didn't dismiss me because I'm a lady priest with tattoos. I didn't dismiss him because he looked a little shabby and saw things I didn't. He was beautiful in the midst of his delusion, and I was surprised and surprisingly serene because of it. On the road to Emmaus, Jesus the Christ meets the disciples as just some guy and asks them what they're talking about. And they respond, "Don't you know? Haven't you heard?" Well, of course he does. He went through it. But he says, "No, man, tell me. What's going on?" Because God always wants to hear about our days and our frustrations and what we're excited about. And so they do. They tell him all their woes, all their expectations and sadness, their incredulity. And then he explains it all to them. The history of God saving humans since the beginning, about God calling them all into compassion, about the man Jesus and how he fit into all of that. And still they don't recognize him. But then they invite him into dinner and he takes bread, blesses, breaks, and gives. It's the Eucharist right in front of them and their eyes are opened and they see him clearly. They see that guy they'd met and they see in him Christ, and eventually they see Christ in all people and all things, infinite love, infinitely giving itself away. Resurrection is about the new life that is constantly coming into the world, especially when it seems most full of death. Resurrection is about seeing each other clearly as made in the image of God, seeing each other with the eyes of love and patience. Resurrection is about participation in this creation God has made, being good stewards of the water and the air and of each other's health and well-being. Resurrection is about listening intently to what others are saying, people we know, people we fear, people we can't understand, hearing their pain and joy and not dismissing it because it's not ours. Resurrection is about being mystified, not recognizing the Christ until later, mistaking Christ for the gardener or the gardener for Christ, mistaking Christ for the stranger or the stranger for Christ. And so, in fact, this is the road to Emmaus, even though it's also Leicester Road in Pleasant Ridge, Ohio, because God made all this and is still pouring themselves out along it. We can meet the risen Christ in every person taking a quarantine walk, and every bird chirp, and every cloudless sky or downpour. Your meals, even though they aren't Eucharist, are communion with God and with all the rest of us, because God makes themselves known to us every time we break the bread together. We often don't recognize the Christ walking alongside us because Christ is never not walking alongside us. In a way, we are now a church on the road, not the church in hiding, locked away in a building like the disciples were, but spread out in the world like yeast in a loaf of bread. Because the church is the gathering of God's people wherever we gather and however we gather. Every one of our houses is the church, is the departure point on the road to Emmaus.